The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as General Marcus Harrison adjusted his uniform in front of the mirror. At 52, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His reputation for harsh discipline and explosive temper had followed him through 3 decades of service. Today would mark the beginning of his downfall, though he had no way of knowing it. Captain Sarah Chun stood outside the general's office, her hands steady despite the storm brewing inside her chest. The daughter of immigrants who had built their American dream through sacrifice and hard work, Sarah had earned her position through merit alone. Her record spoke for itself. Top of her class at West Point, decorated service in 2 combat zones, and a spotless disciplinary record. Yet none of that seemed to matter to General Harrison. The friction between them had been building for months. It started with subtle dismissals during briefings, where the general would interrupt her mid-sentence or redirect questions meant for her to male subordinates. Then came the assignments designed to undermine her authority, being excluded from critical planning sessions, having her recommendations ignored without explanation, and watching less qualified officers receive promotions she deserved. Sarah's breaking point came during a recent operation review. She had identified a serious flaw in the general's proposed strategy that could have endangered lives. When she presented her analysis privately, Harrison accused her of insubordination and questioned her loyalty to the chain of command. The conversation had ended with him warning her to know her place or face consequences. Today's meeting was supposed to address the formal complaint Sarah had filed through proper channels. She had documented every incident, gathered witness statements, and followed protocol to the letter. Military regulations protected whistleblowers and prohibited retaliation, but Sarah knew the reality was often different from the written rules. The general's secretary, a nervous young sergeant named Rodriguez, glanced up from his computer. "Captain Chen, the general will see you now." His voice carried a note of sympathy that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Even the enlisted personnel knew about Harrison's reputation. Sarah knocked twice and entered when she heard the gruff, "Come in." The office was a shrine to Harrison's ego, walls lined with commendations, photos with politicians, and trophies from his various assignments. Behind his massive oak desk, the general sat like a king holding court, his cold gray eyes fixed on her with obvious disdain. "Captain Chun," he said without looking up from the papers spread before him, "I've reviewed your concerns." He spoke the word like it tasted bitter. "Frankly, I'm disappointed. After everything this command has done for you, this is how you repay that investment." Sarah remained at attention, her voice level and professional. "Sir, I followed proper procedures to report violations of military conduct standards. The incidents I documented represent a pattern of discrimination that undermines unit effectiveness and military readiness." Harrison's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his controlled demeanor. "What you documented, Captain, is a commanding officer attempting to correct deficiencies in your performance and attitude. Perhaps if you spent less time playing victim and more time focusing on your duties, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The accusation stung because Sarah knew it was untrue. Her performance evaluations had been consistently excellent until Harrison took command. Her troops respected her leadership, and her tactical knowledge had saved lives on multiple occasions. Yet here she stood, being lectured like a child who had misbehaved. "Sir, with respect, my performance records contradict that assessment. I've maintained the highest standards throughout my career and received commendations from previous commanding officers. The pattern of treatment I've documented began only after you assumed command and appears to target female officers specifically." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Sarah had crossed a line, speaking a truth that Harrison couldn't tolerate hearing. She watched his jaw clench and his hands curl into fists on the desktop. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're walking on very thin ice, Captain," Harrison said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've been patient with your attitude problems, but my patience has limits. You're going to withdraw this complaint and issue a formal apology for wasting everyone's time with your paranoid fantasies." Sarah felt her own anger rising but forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly what Harrison wanted, an emotional reaction he could use to justify whatever punishment he had already decided on. "Sir, I cannot, and will not withdraw a legitimate complaint. The evidence speaks for itself, and military regulations support my right to report violations without fear of retaliation. The general stood slowly, his 6-foot frame imposing in the cramped office space. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Sarah, close enough that she could smell his aftershave and see the network of broken blood vessels across his nose, evidence of too many late nights and too much alcohol. "Let me explain something to you, Captain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with menace. "I've been fighting battles since before you were born. I've earned my position through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. I don't need some uppity little girl questioning my authority or poisoning my command with her feminist propaganda." The insults rolled off Sarah like water, but she could feel the situation escalating beyond the point of no return. Harrison was making his position clear. He viewed her complaint not as a legitimate grievance, but as a personal attack on his authority. In his mind, her very presence in the room was an act of defiance that demanded punishment. "Sir, I've served this country with honor and distinction. My record speaks to my qualifications and commitment. I'm not questioning your authority. I'm asking you to exercise it within the bounds of military law and regulation." Harrison's face went from red to purple, veins standing out on his forehead like twisted rope. He was a man who had built his career on intimidation and had never learned to handle opposition with grace or professionalism. Every word from Sarah's mouth felt like a slap to his ego. "You want to talk about disrespect?" he snarled, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. "Standing there in my office, lecturing me about regulations like I'm some green recruit who doesn't know his job? You're everything that's wrong with today's military. Quota hires who think they're entitled to special treatment." The personal attack crossed every line of professional conduct, but Sarah held her ground. She had expected this reaction and was prepared for it. What she wasn't prepared for was what happened next. Without warning, Harrison's right hand moved in a vicious arc toward her face. The slap was intended to humiliate, to put her in what he considered her proper place. It was an act of violence born from a lifetime of unchecked privilege and authority. But Sarah Chun was not the helpless victim Harrison believed her to be. Her reflexes, honed by years of combat training and actual battlefield experience, kicked in automatically. As his hand approached her cheek, time seemed to slow down. She could see the rage in his eyes, the satisfied smirk beginning to form on his lips, the assumption that she would simply accept this assault as the price of challenging him. Instead, Sarah's left hand snapped up and caught his wrist in an iron grip. Her right hand drove forward in a precise strike to his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward. As he gasped for breath, she pivoted and swept his legs, sending the general crashing to the floor in an undignified heap. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Harrison lay on his back, wheezing and stunned, his uniform disheveled, and his dignity shattered. Sarah stood over him, her breathing steady, her expression calm. She had not lost her temper or acted in anger. She had simply defended herself against an unprovoked attack. The office door burst open as Sergeant Rodriguez rushed in, having heard the commotion. Behind him came 2 military police officers who had been stationed nearby. They stopped short at the sight of their commanding general sprawled on the floor, while a captain stood at attention beside his desk. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said calmly, "please call the base commander and the Inspector General's office. General Harrison just committed assault against a subordinate officer. I defended myself using minimum necessary force." Harrison struggled to sit up, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "You're finished, Chun," he gasped. "I'll see you court-martialed for assaulting a superior officer." But Sarah had learned long ago that the truth was her strongest weapon. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you heard the general's threat just now. The security cameras in this office will show exactly what happened. General Harrison attempted to strike me after I refused his illegal order to withdraw a legitimate complaint. I defended myself as I have every right to do under military law." The MPs looked uncertain, caught between competing authorities and unsure how to proceed. One thing was clear, however: their commanding general had just been taken down by a captain who outweighed him by 60 pounds. The implications of what they were witnessing would ripple through the entire base within hours. As more personnel began arriving in response to the commotion, Sarah remained at attention, her hands clasped behind her back. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, but it was a line Harrison had forced her to cross. The general who ruled through fear and intimidation had finally met someone who wouldn't be intimidated. The real battle was just beginning. Colonel James Mitchell arrived at the scene within 10 minutes of the emergency call. As the base commander, he had seen his share of crises, but nothing quite like this. His deputy commander lay on his office floor, red-faced and sputtering with rage, while Captain Chun maintained perfect military bearing despite having just physically subdued a general officer. The office buzzed with tension as more staff gathered outside. Word spread through the base with the speed of wildfire. The infamous General Harrison had been taken down by a female captain. Some whispered in admiration, others in shock, but everyone understood they were witnessing a seismic shift in the command structure. Colonel Mitchell surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a career officer who had navigated countless political minefields. Harrison struggled to his feet, adjusting his uniform and trying to salvage what remained of his dignity. The general's breathing was still labored, and a red mark on his wrist showed where Sarah had grabbed him. "Someone explain to me exactly what happened here," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in uniform. He knew both officers well, Harrison's reputation for vindictive leadership and Sarah's sterling record. The contrast between them had always troubled him. Harrison stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Colonel, I want Captain Chin arrested immediately for assault on a superior officer. She attacked me without provocation during what should have been a routine administrative meeting." Sarah remained silent until Mitchell turned to her with a questioning look. "Captain Chun, your version of events?" "Sir, General Harrison attempted to strike me after I refused his illegal order to withdraw a formal complaint. I defended myself using minimum necessary force as authorized by military self-defense regulations. Sergeant Rodriguez witnessed the general's threat immediately afterward, and the office security system recorded the entire incident." Mitchell nodded toward the camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the office. "Rodriguez, is that camera functional?" The sergeant swallowed nervously, caught between his loyalty to his commanding officer and his duty to tell the truth. "Yes, sir. It records both audio and video to the base security server." Harrison's face paled slightly. In his rage, he had forgotten about the surveillance system he had insisted on installing to monitor his subordinates' behavior. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "I want that footage secured immediately," Mitchell ordered. "Nobody touches that system until the investigation is complete." He turned back to the two officers. "General Harrison, Captain Chun, you're both confined to quarters pending a full inquiry. This incident will be reported up the chain of command within the hour." As the MPs escorted both officers from the building, the base erupted in barely contained excitement. Enlisted personnel and junior officers who had suffered under Harrison's tyrannical leadership felt a surge of vindication. For the first time in months, people spoke openly about the general's abusive behavior without fear of immediate retaliation. In her quarters, Sarah sat on her narrow military cot and, finally, allowed herself to process what had happened. Her hands shook slightly as adrenaline faded from her system. She had just ended her military career to make a point about dignity and respect. No matter how justified her actions, striking a general officer was career suicide in most circumstances. But Sarah felt no regret. She had joined the military to serve something greater than herself, to protect and defend principles worth fighting for. Allowing Harrison to assault her without consequence would have betrayed everything she believed in. Sometimes standing up for what's right required personal sacrifice. Her phone buzzed with text messages from fellow officers expressing support. Lieutenant Colonel Garcia, one of Harrison's previous targets, wrote, "About time someone stood up to that bully. Half the base is ready to testify about his behavior." Major Williams added, "You did what all of us wanted to do. Thank you for having the courage." Meanwhile, Harrison paced his quarters like a caged animal. His carefully constructed image of invincibility had been shattered in front of his own staff. Worse, The security footage would show him attempting to strike a subordinate, behavior that violated every principle of military leadership he claimed to uphold. Harrison's cell phone rang constantly as word of the incident spread through military channels. His mentor, retired General Thompson, called within an hour of the incident. "Marcus, what the hell happened out there?" Thompson's voice carried disappointment rather than anger. "I'm getting calls from the Pentagon asking if you've lost your mind." "It's not what it looks like," Harrison protested. "That woman has been undermining my authority for months. She filed a bogus complaint full of lies, then got physical when I tried to discipline her properly." Thompson's silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Marcus, I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you let your temper control your judgment more times than I can count. If you laid hands on that officer first, you've given them everything they need to end your career." The truth of those words hit Harrison like a physical blow. His career, his reputation, his pension, everything could disappear because he couldn't control his rage for 30 seconds. The injustice of it consumed him. In his mind, Sarah Chun was the problem, not his own behavior. By evening, representatives from the Inspector General's office had arrived to begin their investigation. The base fell under an unusual quiet as personnel were interviewed one by one. The investigators quickly discovered that Harrison's conflict with Sarah was just the tip of a massive iceberg. Captain Maria Santos, one of the first officers interviewed, provided a detailed account of Harrison's pattern of gender-based harassment. He would make comments about women not belonging in combat roles, assign female officers to meaningless paperwork tasks, and exclude us from important briefings. When Captain Chun started pushing back, he targeted her specifically. Lieutenant Jennifer Park described how Harrison had blocked her promotion recommendation because, in his words, family obligations would interfere with her duties. She had been single at the time with no dependents. Major David Kim reluctantly admitted that Harrison had ordered him to write negative performance reviews for female officers, regardless of their actual performance. He said the military was being forced to lower standards to accommodate political correctness, and it was our duty to maintain traditional values. Each interview painted a clearer picture of systematic discrimination and abuse of power. Harrison hadn't just lost his temper with one subordinate. He had created a hostile environment for every woman under his command. The investigators realized they were dealing with a much larger scandal than initially apparent. The security footage proved devastating to Harrison's case. The high-definition cameras captured every moment of the confrontation in crystal clarity. Harrison's attempt to strike Sarah was unmistakable, as was her restrained and proportional response. The audio picked up his threats, insults, and illegal orders with perfect fidelity. When investigators showed the footage to Harrison's attorney, the lawyer's face went ashen. "General, this video shows you committing assault, threatening a subordinate, and ordering her to withdraw a legitimate complaint. There's no defense strategy that can overcome this evidence." Harrison watched the footage in stunned silence. Seeing himself on screen, red-faced, spittle flying, hand raised to strike a woman who stood at perfect attention, destroyed any illusion he had maintained about his own righteousness. He looked like exactly what he was, a bully who had been caught in the act. News of the incident leaked to military media within 48 hours. Headlines screamed about corruption and abuse in the officer ranks. Sarah's story resonated with current and former service members who had faced similar treatment. Social media erupted with support for her courage and condemnation of Harrison's behavior. The Pentagon faced enormous pressure to take decisive action. Too many sexual assault and harassment scandals had damaged public trust in military leadership. This case offered an opportunity to demonstrate that abuse of power would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or reputation. General Patricia Adams, the first female officer to command a major installation, was appointed to oversee the investigation. Her reputation for fairness and integrity made her the perfect choice to handle such a sensitive case. She arrived at the base with a team of investigators and a mandate to uncover the full scope of the problems. Adams met privately with Sarah on her second day at the base. The general was a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had risen through the ranks during an era when female officers faced even greater barriers than today. "Captain Chun," Adams said as they sat in a secure conference room, I want you to understand that your actions have created ripple effects far beyond this base. You've forced a conversation about leadership and accountability that was long overdue. Sarah sat straight in her chair, uncertain whether she was about to be praised or condemned. Ma'am, I acted in self-defense and within the bounds of military regulations. I take full responsibility for my actions. Good, Adams replied with a slight smile. Because what you did required real courage. Standing up to abusive authority figures always comes with personal risk. The question now is whether the institution has the courage to back you up. The investigation expanded to include Harrison's previous commands. Similar patterns of discrimination emerged at every duty station. Female officers who had tried to report his behavior found their complaints buried or dismissed. Male officers who had witnessed misconduct remained silent to protect their own careers. Harrison's allies in the Pentagon began distancing themselves as the scope of the scandal became clear. Powerful mentors who had protected him for decades suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere when reporters started asking questions. The general who had seemed untouchable just days earlier found himself completely isolated. As the evidence mounted, Harrison's attorney advised him to consider a plea agreement. The alternative was a court-martial that would expose every detail of his misconduct to public scrutiny. His career was over regardless, but cooperation might salvage his pension and spare his family additional humiliation. Sarah continued her duties under close security protection. Death threats had started arriving from Harrison's supporters, along with thousands of messages of support from fellow service members. She had become a symbol of resistance to institutional sexism, whether she wanted that role or not. The transformation of the base was remarkable. Officers who had lived in fear of Harrison's arbitrary punishments began speaking openly about problems and solutions. Morale improved dramatically as people realized they could voice concerns without facing retaliation. But Sarah knew the real test would come when the investigation concluded. Would the military institution protect those who spoke truth to power, or would it find ways to punish whistleblowers despite public pressure? The answer would determine whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile. The spotlight was about to intensify as national media discovered the story. Sarah's moment of self-defense was becoming a flashpoint for larger debates about military culture, gender equality, and the price of challenging corrupt authority. The quiet captain who just wanted to do her job had accidentally started a revolution. The story exploded across national news 3 days after the incident when a leaked portion of the security footage appeared online. The 30-second clip showed Harrison raising his hand to strike Sarah, her lightning-fast defensive response, and the general crashing to the floor. Within hours, the video had millions of views and sparked fierce debate across social media platforms. Sarah found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as reporters camped outside the base gates. Her parents, who had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope and determination, watched in bewilderment as their daughter became the center of a national controversy. They had raised her to work hard, follow rules, and avoid drawing attention to herself. Sarah, her mother said during their video call, her voice thick with worry, "Why didn't you just let him hit you? Now everyone knows your name. This is not safe." Sarah understood her mother's fear. In their culture, confronting authority directly was often seen as dangerous and foolish. But Sarah had been shaped by American military values that demanded courage in the face of injustice. "Mama, I couldn't let him assault me and get away with it. If I stayed silent, he would have done worse to other women." Her father, a man who had worked 2 jobs to put Sarah through college, spoke quietly from beside her mother. "Your mother worries because she loves you. But I am proud. In our country, we couldn't fight back against corrupt officials. Here, you can. That's why we came to America." The investigation team had grown to include FBI agents specializing in civil rights violations. General Adams coordinated multiple law enforcement agencies as the scope of Harrison's misconduct became staggering. Financial irregularities emerged alongside the harassment charges. Unauthorized contracts with companies that provided kickbacks, misuse of military resources for personal benefit, and falsified reports to cover up training accidents. Major Collins, Harrison's former aide-de-camp, provided crucial testimony about the general's criminal activities. He treated the military like his personal kingdom, Collins told investigators. Rules applied to everyone else, never to him. I documented everything because I knew someday it would matter. The evidence Collins provided painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning 5 years. Harrison had created a network of loyalists who participated in or ignored his illegal activities in exchange for favorable assignments and promotions. The rot extended throughout his previous commands, affecting hundreds of military personnel. Harrison's wife, Margaret, filed for divorce as the scandal consumed their family. 23 years of marriage crumbled as reporters revealed the full extent of her husband's behavior. She released a statement expressing support for his victims. I had no knowledge of Marcus's professional misconduct, but I cannot remain married to someone who abused his position to harm others. The general's adult children faced harassment at their jobs and schools. His son David, a lieutenant in the Navy, requested a name change to avoid association with his father's crimes. The family Harrison had claimed to protect through his actions was destroyed by the consequences of those same actions. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Sarah's actions. Veterans organizations praised her courage, and women's groups held rallies demanding accountability for military leaders who abused their power. Congressional representatives called for hearings on military culture and leadership standards. Sarah maintained her focus on duty despite the media circus surrounding her. She continued her regular assignments while cooperating fully with investigators. Her commanding presence and articulate responses during interviews impressed even skeptical journalists who had expected to find a publicity-seeking troublemaker. CNN's Anderson Cooper interviewed Sarah for a primetime special. Captain Chen, some people are saying you could have reported the general's behavior without engaging in physical confrontation. How do you respond to that criticism? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Mr. Cooper, I had already filed formal complaints through proper channels. General Harrison was ordering me to withdraw those complaints when he attempted to assault me. At that moment, I had to choose between allowing myself to be victimized or defending myself within the law. I chose to defend myself. Do you regret your actions? Cooper pressed. I regret that it came to that point, Sarah replied carefully. I regret that the military allowed General Harrison's behavior to continue unchecked for so long. But I don't regret defending myself or speaking up for others who couldn't. The interview generated massive viewership and further shifted public opinion in Sarah's favor. Her calm professionalism contrasted sharply with leaked audio recordings of Harrison's explosive outbursts during interviews with investigators. Behind the scenes, Pentagon officials worked frantically to contain the damage to military reputation. The scandal threatened to undermine recruitment efforts and erode public trust in military leadership. Defense Secretary Williams convened a task force to review leadership training and accountability measures across all service branches. Harrison's court-martial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. His attorney, desperate to minimize his client's exposure, proposed a plea agreement that would result in dismissal from service but avoid federal criminal charges. The prosecution team rejected the offer, insisting that Harrison's crimes deserved the fullest possible punishment. The general's mental state deteriorated as he faced the collapse of everything he had worked to build. Friends reported erratic behavior and signs of severe depression. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a broken man who could barely make eye contact with former subordinates. Sarah received death threats that required FBI protection. Some came from Harrison's supporters who viewed her as a traitor to military hierarchy. Others originated from misogynistic groups that saw her success as a threat to traditional male authority. The irony wasn't lost on her that standing up for military values had made her a target of some military personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, one of Harrison's former victims, testified before Congress about the broader culture of harassment in the military. General Harrison wasn't an isolated case, she told the packed hearing room. He was the product of a system that protects abusers and silences victims. Captain Chen's courage exposed what many of us have endured in silence. The congressional hearing featured emotional testimony from dozens of current and former military personnel. Their stories revealed a pattern of institutional failure that extended far beyond one general's criminal behavior. Committee members from both parties expressed outrage and demanded comprehensive reforms. Sarah's testimony before Congress was broadcast live on major networks. She wore her dress blue uniform with perfect precision, her bearing dignified despite the intensity of questioning from hostile committee members. Representative Johnson, known for his support of traditional military hierarchy, attempted to portray Sarah as a disgruntled troublemaker. Captain Chun, isn't it true that you had previous conflicts with superior officers throughout your career? No, sir, that is not accurate, Sarah responded firmly. My performance evaluations prior to General Harrison's command were consistently excellent. The conflicts began only when I served under an officer who violated military standards and regulations. But you admit to using violence against a superior officer? Johnson pressed. I defended myself against an unprovoked assault, as I was trained to do and as military regulations permit. The security footage clearly shows General Harrison attempting to strike me before I responded with minimal necessary force. Johnson's hostile questioning backfired as other committee members and media commentators criticized his apparent bias. Social media erupted with support for Sarah and condemnation of Johnson's inappropriate line of inquiry. The most powerful moment came when Sarah addressed the committee's final question about her hopes for the future. I joined the military to serve my country and protect the Constitution. I hope my experience leads to changes that ensure other service members don't face the choice between their safety and their careers. No one should have to choose between being victimized and being punished for defending themselves. Her words resonated across the country and beyond. International media picked up the story as an example of individual courage challenging institutional corruption. Sarah received messages of support from activists and military personnel around the world. The political pressure for accountability became overwhelming. Pentagon leadership announced sweeping reforms to harassment reporting procedures, leadership training requirements, and accountability measures for senior officers. While critics argued the changes didn't go far enough, even modest reforms represented significant progress. Harrison's allies abandoned him completely as public opinion crystallized against him. Former mentors who had protected his career for decades refused to testify on his behalf. The network of corruption he had built collapsed as participants sought plea agreements to avoid prosecution. The base where everything started transformed dramatically under new leadership. Colonel Mitchell implemented open-door policies, regular climate surveys, and transparent promotion processes. Female enrollment in military schools reached record levels as young women saw Sarah's example of standing up for principles. Sarah's parents visited the base for the first time since the incident. They met with General Adams and toured the facilities where their daughter worked. Seeing the respect and admiration Sarah commanded from her peers helped them understand the significance of her actions. Your daughter is a true leader, General Adams told Sarah's parents during a private dinner. She sacrificed her own comfort and safety to protect others. That's the kind of moral courage we need more of in uniform. Sarah's father, who had always been a man of few words, spoke emotionally about his pride in his daughter's choices. In our old country, fighting corruption meant risking everything. Here, the system protects those who do right. Sarah proved the system can work when good people have courage. As Harrison's court-martial approached, investigators continued uncovering new evidence of his crimes. The case had grown from a simple assault charge to a complex web of corruption, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. Legal experts predicted it would become a landmark case in military justice. Sarah knew her life would never return to normal. She had become a symbol of resistance to institutional abuse, whether she wanted that role or not. The quiet career she had planned was impossible now, but perhaps she could use her unwanted fame to create positive change for future generations of service members. The real test would come when the media attention faded and the reforms were implemented. Would the military institution truly change, or would it find new ways to protect abusive leaders while punishing those who challenged them? Sarah's courage had opened a door, but others would have to walk through it to create lasting transformation. The court-martial of General Marcus Harrison began on a cold Monday morning in November. Military prosecutors had assembled an overwhelming case spanning 27 separate charges, from assault and corruption to civil rights violations. The proceeding would be the most closely watched military trial in decades. Sarah entered the courthouse in her dress uniform, flanked by FBI agents assigned to her protection detail. Death threats had intensified as the trial approached, forcing authorities to implement unprecedented security measures. The woman who had defended herself in a general's office now required federal protection to testify about it. The prosecution team, led by Colonel Patricia Reeves, had spent months building an ironclad case. Evidence included the security footage, financial records showing years of corruption, and testimony from dozens of Harrison's victims. The pattern of abuse was so extensive that prosecutors struggled to fit everything into a reasonable trial timeline. Harrison sat at the defense table looking gaunt and defeated. The commanding presence that had once intimidated subordinates had vanished, replaced by a broken man who could barely maintain eye contact with his accusers. His attorney, a civilian lawyer specializing in military defense, faced a nearly impossible task. Judge Colonel Williams, a respected military jurist with 30 years of experience, called the proceedings to order. This court-martial will examine serious allegations of misconduct by a senior officer. We will conduct these proceedings with the dignity and fairness that military justice demands. The first witness was Sergeant Rodriguez, who had witnessed the confrontation in Harrison's office. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity. I heard raised voices, then sounds of a struggle. When I entered, General Harrison was on the floor, and Captain Chun was standing at attention. She immediately requested that I contact the base commander and Inspector General. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney attempted to suggest that Rodriguez's account was unreliable. Sergeant, isn't it possible that Captain Chun struck the general first, and you didn't see it? Rodriguez looked confused by the question. Sir, I watched the security footage afterward. It clearly shows General Harrison attempting to hit Captain Chun. There's no ambiguity about who initiated physical contact. The defense strategy of creating doubt about the incident collapsed immediately. With video evidence available, attempting to argue about what happened made the defense appear desperate or dishonest. Captain Santos testified about the pattern of gender-based harassment that had characterized Harrison's leadership. Her detailed account of discriminatory comments and actions painted a picture of systematic bias that went far beyond any single incident. General Harrison told our staff meeting that women in combat roles were a social experiment that was weakening military readiness, Santos testified. He said female officers received promotions based on quotas rather than merit, and that real leaders needed to compensate for these political appointments. The defense attorney's cross-examination revealed the weakness of Harrison's position. Captain Santos, did General Harrison ever explicitly state that he was targeting female officers for different treatment? He didn't need to state it explicitly, sir. His actions made his intentions clear. Female officers received different assignments, different evaluation criteria, and different disciplinary standards. The pattern was obvious to everyone who worked under him. Major Collins, Harrison's former aide, provided the most damaging testimony about corruption and abuse of power. His meticulous records documented years of illegal activities that Harrison had believed were safely hidden from oversight. General Harrison treated military resources as his personal property, Collins testified. He used government vehicles for family vacations, assigned enlisted personnel to work on his private residence, and awarded contracts to companies that provided kickbacks. When I expressed concerns, he told me that senior officers earned these privileges through their service. The financial evidence was staggering. Prosecutors presented evidence of more than $200,000 in misappropriated funds, fraudulent travel claims, and unauthorized use of military personnel for personal benefit. Harrison had essentially operated his own private business using government resources. Harrison's defense crumbled further when his former executive officer testified about orders to falsify training records and safety reports. Several accidents had been covered up to protect Harrison's promotion prospects, potentially endangering lives to preserve his career advancement. Sarah's testimony became the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She described the escalating pattern of harassment, the ignored complaints, and, finally, the confrontation that had brought everything into the open. General Harrison told me to withdraw my complaint and apologize for wasting everyone's time, Sarah testified. When I refused, he became increasingly agitated. He made personal attacks on my character and qualifications, then threatened my career. When he raised his hand to strike me, I defended myself using minimum necessary force. The prosecution played the security footage in its entirety. The courtroom fell silent as they watched Harrison's attempted assault and Sarah's defensive response. Even hardened military officers appeared shocked by the general's behavior. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney made a final attempt to shift blame to Sarah. "Captain Chun, didn't you deliberately provoke General Harrison by challenging his authority?" Sarah's response was calm and precise. "Sir, I followed proper procedures to report violations of military conduct standards. If reporting illegal behavior constitutes provocation, then the military justice system has no meaning." The defense attorney pressed further. "But you could have simply followed his orders and avoided any confrontation. Following illegal orders would have made me complicit in violations of military law and regulations. My oath of office required me to refuse such orders. General Harrison's attempt to strike me was criminal assault, regardless of his rank or position." Sarah's steadfast professionalism contrasted sharply with recorded evidence of Harrison's explosive outbursts and irrational behavior. The jury of senior officers could clearly see which person had acted with honor and which had disgraced the uniform. Expert witnesses testified about the broader impact of Harrison's leadership on unit effectiveness and morale. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a military psychologist, explained how toxic leadership created environments where mission accomplishment became secondary to avoiding abuse. General Harrison's command style created what we call psychological safety deficits, Dr. Carter testified. Personnel were afraid to report problems, share information, or take initiative. This type of environment has been linked to mission failures and increased casualty rates in combat situations. The prosecution's final witness was General Adams, who testified about the institutional changes implemented in response to Sarah's case. Her testimony emphasized how one person's courage could catalyze system-wide improvements. "Captain Chin's actions forced us to confront problems we had ignored for too long," General Adams testified. Her example showed other victims that reporting abuse was possible and that the institution would protect those who came forward. Harrison's defense team called only 3 witnesses, including a psychiatrist who testified about the general's deteriorating mental health. The strategy of portraying Harrison as a victim of stress and pressure fell flat when prosecutors revealed that his abusive behavior had been consistent throughout his career. The defense's closing argument attempted to frame Harrison as a dedicated officer whose career had been destroyed by political correctness and oversensitivity to traditional military discipline. The argument ignored the extensive evidence of criminal behavior and suggested that Harrison was being scapegoated for systemic problems. Colonel Reeves delivered a devastating closing argument that systematically dismantled every aspect of Harrison's defense. General Harrison wasn't enforcing military discipline. He was abusing his authority for personal gratification. He wasn't maintaining standards. He was violating them. Captain Chin didn't destroy his career. She exposed his crimes. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all 27 charges. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of Harrison's guilt. Judge Colonel Williams sentenced Harrison to 10 years in military prison, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and dismissal from service. The sentence was the maximum possible under military law and sent a clear message about the consequences of abusing military authority. "General Harrison, you violated every principle of military leadership and betrayed the trust placed in you by your subordinates and your nation," Judge Williams said during sentencing. "Your actions brought dishonor to the uniform and endangered the personnel under your command. This sentence reflects the severity of your crimes and the necessity of deterring similar conduct by others." Harrison showed no emotion as the sentence was read. His military career, which had spanned 3 decades, ended in complete disgrace. He would serve his time in a military prison alongside other officers who had fallen from grace. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as victims and supporters realized that justice had prevailed. Many of Harrison's former subordinates wept with relief, finally, seeing accountability for years of abuse they had endured in silence. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as she watched her former commander led away in shackles. She had never wanted to destroy anyone's career, but Harrison's actions had made accountability inevitable. His downfall was the result of his own choices, not her courage in resisting them. Outside the courthouse, Sarah faced a wall of reporters and cameras. She had prepared a brief statement that focused on the broader implications of the case rather than personal satisfaction with the verdict. This trial wasn't about revenge or personal grievances, she told the assembled media. It was about ensuring that military leaders are held to the standards they demand from others. Today's verdict shows that rank and position cannot protect those who abuse their authority. A reporter shouted a question about her future plans. Sarah paused before responding. I joined the military to serve my country, and I intend to continue that service. I hope this case leads to lasting changes that protect future generations of service members from the abuse we endured. The Pentagon announced that Sarah would be promoted to major and assigned to a prestigious position developing new leadership training programs. Her unwanted fame would be channeled into positive institutional change, ensuring that her sacrifice would benefit others who might face similar challenges. Harrison's conviction sent shockwaves through military leadership circles. Senior officers who had previously ignored harassment complaints suddenly became attentive to personnel issues. The fear of following Harrison to prison proved more effective than years of training and policy changes. Sarah's parents attended the sentencing, their pride evident despite their ongoing concerns about their daughter's safety. They had come to understand that her courage served a purpose larger than personal advancement or recognition. As news of the verdict spread internationally, Sarah received messages from military personnel and civilians around the world who had faced similar challenges. Her example had inspired others to speak up against abuse and corruption in their own organizations and institutions. The woman who had simply wanted to serve her country with honor had become a symbol of institutional accountability and moral courage. The price had been enormous, but the impact would echo through military culture for generations to come. 2 years after the trial, Major Sarah Chun stood before a classroom of future military officers at the prestigious National Defense University. The same woman who had defended herself against a general's assault now taught leadership ethics to the next generation of commanders. Her journey from victim to symbol to educator represented the military's commitment to real change. The students listened intently as Sarah described the principles of moral courage and institutional accountability. Her lectures weren't theoretical discussions, but practical lessons drawn from lived experience. She taught them that leadership meant protecting subordinates, not exploiting them. True military authority comes from competence, integrity, and service to others, Sarah explained to her students. The moment you use your rank to intimidate or abuse subordinates, you've stopped leading and started bullying. History will judge you by how you treated those who couldn't fight back. One student raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you report misconduct when the system seems designed to protect senior officers? Sarah smiled, remembering asking similar questions as a young officer. The system is only as strong as the people who comprise it. Yes, reporting misconduct involves risk, but staying silent guarantees that abuse continues. We have ethical obligations that transcend our personal comfort. The reforms implemented after Harrison's conviction had transformed military culture in measurable ways. Harassment complaints were investigated by independent offices rather than local commanders. Anonymous reporting systems allowed personnel to raise concerns without fear of immediate retaliation. Leadership training emphasized moral courage alongside tactical competence. Sarah's role in developing these programs had earned her rapid promotion and national recognition. She had been featured on magazine covers, invited to speak at universities, and consulted by corporations seeking to improve their workplace cultures. The reluctant hero had found purpose in her unwanted fame. General Adams, now a Pentagon senior leader, often cited Sarah's case as proof that institutional change was possible. Captain Chun could have remained silent and protected her career, Adams told a gathering of international military leaders. Instead, she chose courage over comfort and forced us all to confront uncomfortable truths about our culture. The base where everything started had become a model for healthy military leadership. Colonel Mitchell, promoted to general, implemented programs that emphasized transparency, accountability, and respect for all personnel. Female enrollment in military academies reached historic levels as young women saw examples of successful female leaders being protected rather than punished. Harrison served his sentence in a minimum security military prison in Kansas. Fellow inmates included other officers who had fallen from grace through corruption or abuse. His daily routine consisted of janitorial work, mandatory counseling sessions, and long hours reflecting on the choices that had destroyed his life. Prison psychologist Dr. Robert Kim worked with Harrison for 18 months before achieving any meaningful breakthrough. The former general had initially blamed everyone except himself for his downfall: Sarah, the media, political correctness, and changing military culture. "I gave 30 years of my life to the military," Harrison said during one early session. "I made tough decisions that kept soldiers alive. Then, one complaint from a disgruntled subordinate destroys everything I built." Dr. Kim challenged Harrison's narrative carefully. "Marcus, let's look at the evidence presented at your trial. Multiple witnesses testified about years of abusive behavior. Financial records showed systematic corruption. How do you explain that pattern?" The breakthrough came when Harrison finally watched the complete security footage of his confrontation with Sarah. Seeing himself through objective eyes, watching his face contort with rage, his hand raised to strike a subordinate who stood at attention, shattered his self-justifying delusions. "That's not who I thought I was," Harrison said quietly after viewing the footage for the first time. "I became everything I claimed to oppose. I became a bully who used rank to hurt people." His journey toward genuine accountability would take years and might never fully succeed. Some damage to character and reputation cannot be repaired through prison sentences or counseling sessions. But recognizing the truth about his actions was a necessary first step. Margaret Harrison rebuilt her life after divorcing her husband and changing her name. She became an advocate for military families affected by leadership abuse, using her experience to help others recognize warning signs of toxic behavior. Her work helped dozens of families escape situations similar to her own. "I ignored obvious signs because I didn't want to believe my husband was capable of such behavior," Margaret told a support group meeting. "I made excuses for his temper and rationalized his treatment of others. That enabled him to hurt more people." Sarah's parents had adjusted to their daughter's fame with characteristic grace and dignity. They attended her promotion ceremonies and speaking engagements, proud of her accomplishments, but worried about the ongoing security concerns that followed public recognition. During a family dinner at Sarah's quarters, her mother expressed continuing anxiety about her daughter's safety. "The threats still come sometimes. Why can't you just do normal military work now?" Sarah understood her mother's concerns, but felt obligated to use her platform responsibly. "Mama, other people need to see that challenging corrupt authority is possible and sometimes necessary. If I hide from that responsibility, I waste the opportunity to help others." Her father, now in his 70s, had gained perspective on his daughter's choices. "Your mother worries because she loves you. But I see the bigger picture. You didn't just defend yourself that day. You defended everyone who comes after you." The ripple effects of Sarah's courage extended far beyond the military. Corporate leaders studied her case as an example of ethical whistleblowing. University ethics programs used her story to illustrate moral courage in organizational settings. International human rights organizations cited her example when advocating for protection of abuse victims. A documentary about the case, titled Standing Ground, won several awards and reached millions of viewers worldwide. The film balanced Sarah's personal story with analysis of institutional culture and the challenges faced by those who challenge corrupt authority. Sarah had mixed feelings about the documentary's success. While it spread awareness about important issues, she preferred focusing on her current work rather than relitigating past events. Fame remained an uncomfortable burden she carried in service of larger purposes. The military academy where Sarah now taught had renamed its leadership center in her honor. The Saracen Center for Ethical Leadership hosted seminars, research programs, and mentorship opportunities for officers throughout their careers. Sarah was deeply moved by the recognition, but insisted the center focus on principles rather than personalities. Lieutenant Colonel Garcia, one of Harrison's early victims who had been afraid to speak up, now served as Sarah's deputy director. Her transformation from frightened subordinate to confident leader illustrated the broader changes Sarah's courage had catalyzed. Major Chen showed us that speaking up was possible, Garcia told new students during orientation. She paid a price for that courage, but her example protected all of us who came after. That's what real leadership looks like. Young officers often approach Sarah for advice about handling ethical dilemmas in their own careers. She emphasized that moral courage required practice and preparation, not just good intentions. You don't develop moral courage in the moment of crisis, Sarah taught them. You develop it through daily choices to do the right thing when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. When the big test comes, you'll respond based on the habits you've already formed. The military justice system had been reformed based partly on lessons learned from Harrison's case. Independent prosecutors now handled serious misconduct cases, reducing the influence of local commanders who might have conflicts of interest. Victim advocacy programs provided support and protection for those who reported abuse. Sarah's influence extended to congressional legislation requiring enhanced protections for military whistleblowers. The Chun Amendment, as it became known, created additional safeguards against retaliation and streamlined reporting procedures for misconduct allegations. Senator Williams, who had initially opposed the legislation, eventually became one of its strongest supporters after meeting with Sarah and hearing testimony from abuse victims. Major Chen's case showed us that protecting people who speak up isn't about politics. It's about maintaining the integrity of our military institutions. 5 years after her confrontation with Harrison, Sarah was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to lead a joint military-civilian task force on organizational ethics. Her expertise was now sought by institutions far beyond the military, from police departments to corporate boards. The task force's work influenced policy in dozens of organizations struggling with toxic leadership and abuse of power. Sarah's practical approach, grounded in real experience rather than academic theory, resonated with leaders who needed concrete solutions to complex cultural problems. During a late evening video call with her parents, Sarah reflected on the unexpected direction her life had taken. I never wanted to be famous or become a symbol for anything. I just wanted to serve my country and be left alone to do my job. Her mother, now more understanding of her daughter's mission, smiled gently. Sometimes God chooses people for purposes they don't expect. You have helped so many others find courage to stand up for what is right. Sarah's legacy was still being written, but its essential elements were already clear. A young woman's moment of self-defense had exposed institutional rot and forced systemic change. Her courage in that critical moment had protected countless others who might have faced similar abuse. The military was not perfect, and challenges remained. But the culture that had protected Harrison and punished his victims was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something healthier. Future generations of service members would benefit from Sarah's unwillingness to accept abuse as the price of military service. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she thought about the young officers she would teach tomorrow. They would face their own ethical challenges and moments when courage would be tested. Her job was to prepare them for those moments and ensure they understood that doing the right thing, however difficult, was always possible. The general who had tried to strike her in anger was now a cautionary tale told in leadership classes around the world. The captain who had defended herself had become a teacher, leader, and symbol of institutional accountability. The moment that could have destroyed her career had instead transformed it into something more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. History would remember Marcus Harrison as a warning about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. It would remember Sarah Chun as proof that individual courage could challenge institutional abuse and win. The difference between them came down to choices, his to abuse authority, hers to resist abuse regardless of the personal cost. The story that began with violence in a general's office had become a lesson about the power of moral courage to transform institutions and protect the vulnerable. Sarah's moment of self-defense had grown into a lifetime of service that would echo through military culture for generations to come.